So when I made this video about how Japanese kids speak Japanese, I noticed that some of them don't quite speak Japanese correctly all the time. For example, listen to this 5-year-old girl. She's making her stuffed toys eat ice cream.
こんな天気にアイスを食べに来たのね。
いい天気 means beautiful weather. She said, こんないい天気にアイスを食べに来たのね。You came to eat ice cream on this beautiful day. But this ni doesn't quite make sense. At the first segment, こんないい天気に doesn't quite connect well with アイスを食べに来たのね。If you say こんないい天気に I would expect to hear something like なった. So こんないい天気になった. It turned to be such beautiful weather, something like that. So her speech is not very adult-like. She could say something like いい天気だからアイスを食べに来たのね. Because the weather is good, you came to eat ice cream. Or you can use 暑い hot and say 暑いからアイスを食べに来たのね. Because it's hot, you came to eat ice cream. But this made me think, well, maybe Japanese kids don't quite use particles correctly. So I looked up some research, and it turned out, yes, they do make particle mistakes. For example, this experiment gave particle quizzes to 3 to 5-year-olds, and a lot of them got them wrong. And there's another paper that shows young kids don't always use wa correctly. And that made me quite curious. I want to hear more Japanese kids speak Japanese to see if they make particle mistakes so that Anya won't feel bad about making Japanese mistakes. And I collected some footage, so let me show you some of it. We're gonna start with this boy. He's 4 and he's playing a doctor, and his mom is playing a patient.
何の病気でしたか？はい。
ちょっと体がもう熱になっています。
体が熱ですか？
He said, 体がもう熱になっています。体 body, もう already, 熱 fever. Now, 熱になっています is a contraction of 熱になっています。So a formal version would be 体がもう熱になっています。Your body has already become feverish or something like that, and this is not very adult-like. 体が here doesn't make a lot of sense here because if you want to use 体が, it's going to be something like 体が熱っぽいです. My body is feverish. But this is mostly how we talk about our own body. So doctors, they probably wouldn't say this. If there's something that doctors would say, it would be something like 熱があります. You have a fever. So that didn't sound quite right, although it's understandable. Now, let me show you another example. This is a 5-year-old boy, and he's telling his mom about his morning. A lot of people say he looks like a girl, but he's actually a boy.
朝から何したの？
朝はね、着替えしなくてよかったんだって。
そうだよね。
終業式が制服すごくじゃなくて制服で来なきゃいけないんだよ。
So, 終業式 is like an end of term ceremony. 制服 uniform. 普通の normal. 服 clothes. So he's saying that you have to wear a uniform instead of normal clothes to go to the end of term ceremony. Now this is interesting because he started saying 終業式が using が, then he paused and he said は. So it sounds like he's correcting his own particle because in the context of this conversation, が actually wouldn't make sense, but は does. So you can tell that he understands how we use が and は differently, and he corrected himself. And he's also a bit older than the other kids in this video, and that could be why. Now, next example, this boy is 4 years old, and he's talking about Sakura, cherry blossoms.
おき桜好き？おき桜好き？
桜って筋なんだけど、筋だよ。
好きなんだけど好きだよ。好きなんだけど好きなの？
Now, he said, 桜って好きなんだけど好きだよ. I like cherry blossoms, but I like cherry blossoms. So it's not technically incorrect, but it doesn't make a lot of sense because when we hear 好きなんだけど, I like cherry blossoms, we would expect to hear something different such as 好きなんだけど見たことない。I like them, but I've never seen them. Something like that. But he continued with 好きだよ. I like them. And his mom noticed it and she was amused. Now, I have another interesting example from this boy.
3月が終わると4月。4月が終わると5月。
4月じゃないんだよ。4月っていうの。
Now, he mispronounced 4月, April, as 4月, and his mom corrected it because he apparently hasn't seen 4月は君の嘘, Your Lie in April. He should watch it when he's old enough to appreciate sadness. Now, let me show you yet another example. This boy is 4 years old and he's making a pancake.
ケーキ1個ください。
はーい。どこバター塗って、それで、あとフライパンで焼くだけ。それで、ひっくり返して、じゃあ、トラネコパー。
Now, did you spot any mistakes? I didn't. His Japanese was perfectly fine. Now, I'm not sure if he actually said バターを塗って to spread butter or バター塗って without o, but either way, it's fine. So he didn't make any mistakes, although his pancake was done suspiciously fast, so I'm not sure if it's fully cooked. But yeah, kids around his age, even though they don't always make mistakes, they do sometimes. But their mistakes are not just about particles. Sometimes their sentences are not technically incorrect, but they sound weird and non-native-like, just like this green owl. But I would say, don't worry, Anya, other kids make mistakes too. And I kind of want to do a follow-up experiment where I ask them to interpret particles correctly. Because in this video, we let them speak freely. So if they are not comfortable with some particles, maybe they can avoid using them. So that's an idea. But if you want to learn Japanese with me, I will teach you how to use particles properly, like the native way, because I will help you acquire Japanese with natural but easy and properly contextualized examples. So click on the link in the description or on the screen and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuza.